Hey there, welcome. Today we're going to be walking through hopefully the rest of chapter 1 of Jameson's Marxism and Form. If you haven't seen the previous video, we did a couple of hours on the first 19 pages a couple of days ago, and I'm going to try to get through all of the remainder of chapter 1 today. So it'll probably be a slightly longer stream, maybe 3 or 4 hours. The format here, if you haven't seen this before, is to read through the entire text. So we'll read aloud. There'll be sections where I'm just reading aloud the text, and then there'll also be a switch in the way that we're reading the text, where we'll switch to close reading and look more specifically at some of the passages, try to interpret a few of the passages, and try to understand better what is being said. So to start with, I just want to review where we got to last time. And this diagram here is an indication of what we did last time. We're not going to go over all of this in detail to review, but there's just a couple of key points that I want to bring out which will be important for this next section that we're coming to. So last time we talked about Jameson's project as being depicted by this triangle here, where Jameson wants to look at literature as an object that shows us something about the dialectical structure of the world. And in particular, he wants to bring into the Anglo-American, the English-speaking context, something of German and French philosophical cultures. And he wants to do this to combat what he calls the empiricism of the English approach. So in this chapter 1, we've started looking at Jameson's reading of Adorno. And Adorno is interested in what Adorno calls the culture industry and a critique of the culture industry. And in particular, Adorno is interested in music, or at least Jameson is interested in Adorno's interest in music. So where we left off last time was looking at the idea of the concert hall, this transition that Adorno is seeing from the violin to the saxophone, or rather that Jameson is remarking about the transition from the violin to the saxophone, and a distinction between different composers and the way that they deal with the tonal system. And Jameson has said that this is interesting to Adorno because the relationship that these composers have to tonality, to the structure of the tonal system, is what makes music interesting as a cultural object that shows something of the dialectical structure of reality. So Jameson has said that what Adorno shows in music is something of music as an autonomous system. So he uses this idea of music as an autonomous system, and he talks about music as an autonomous system having an internal dialectic. So we've got some of the key terms here. I just want to highlight the ones that are going to become very important in our reading as we go forward. One is tonality, the structure of the tonal system. Another is this idea of music as an autonomous system. And autonomous here means basically it deals with its own laws. It has its own kind of structure that is not contingent or dependent on something else. And the something else that's of particular relevance here is the hum and drum of everyday reality. So music as an autonomous system allows the listener to reflect on the hum and drum of everyday reality by inhabiting the laws of this different system, which are constructed in some way in relation to the hum and drum of everyday reality, but are not completely determined by everyday reality, and therefore can allow the listener to see something different in everyday reality or in the structure of reality. So Jameson's investment in music as an autonomous system is related to its ability to show us as listeners something of the dialectical structure of reality. And the figures that will be particularly important in the critique that we're about to read are some composers whose names represent different approaches to the structure of tonality. So we have Beethoven, we have Wagner, who we've already talked about, and we will also get to Schoenberg and Stravinsky. And there is a rough historical progression here from Beethoven to Wagner to Schoenberg and Stravinsky. But Jameson is not going to explicitly contextualize the sort of historical impact that each of these composers had on each other. And by historical impact, I mean he's not going to talk about whether Wagner was consciously or self-consciously interested in Beethoven's music or Schoenberg was interested in Wagner's music. He's going to talk about the development of a relation of music as such to the tonal system through these different composers. And we'll get into this more as we go, but the reason that these composers are interesting to Adorno and to Jameson is because the idea is that what they represent, what these names represent as approaches to the structure of the tonal system, show us something different or a new perspective on, as I said, the structure of dialectical reality. But what does the structure of dialectical reality mean, right? This is something we'll be continuously unpacking as we go on through Jameson's book. The structure of dialectical reality is related to these terms that we have talked about at the very beginning up here. Right? These dialectical tensions between the concrete and the abstract, between appearance and essence, between content and form, and fundamentally between the subject and the object. So, as we talked about with this analogy of the street in the last session up here, and the taking place of political action on a street, the claim of dialectical reality, or the position of a dialectical reading of reality, is that an object cannot be divorced from its subject, just as the subject cannot be divorced from the object. These terms are entangled in a way where the statement of one always implies the other. This is true for all of the dialectical dyads that we've looked at here: concrete and the abstract, spirit and matter, superstructure and infrastructure. These terms are defined in relation to their opposite in some sense, and they work together in order to help us understand each of them. So when we talk about the way in which these composers for Adorno show us something about the structure of dialectical reality, we will come to be interested in what they show us of subjectivity, of the relation of the subject to the world, and of objectivity, of when and why the world determines the subject, or when and why conditions determine the way that we think about reality. So this is the program that has already been laid out in some sense by Jameson, and we will get into this in just a moment. The last thing I want to note before we get into this is the return of the specter with which we began, or with which rather Jameson began this entire analysis, which is literature. So Jameson's program in this book is to show us why literature is this important object within in seeing the structure of dialectical reality. And here we've taken, it might seem a bit of a digression into Adorno's analysis of music and critique of music, where music is not the same thing as literature. But, and Jameson has already hinted at this in just this last page that we read, where he introduced the idea of Proust, literature is being positioned here by Jameson as an analog to music in Adorno's critique of it. And you'll remember that we talked about this idea of the footnote and Jameson's kind of critique of the structure of a footnote in a footnote itself. And also the idea of the heroic simile, that there is this way in which moving to a different kind of context, to a different set of things, in comparison, in analogy with the set of things that we are interested in, with the subject matter at hand, is a necessary movement in the dialectical revelation of reality, or the dialectical detailing of reality. And so this continuous kind of parenthesizing, where Jameson will jump between music and literature, as we'll see, is in a part of Jameson's method, where it is an important moment in the way that he is thinking about showing what he is trying to show. So even though this chapter is about music as its express kind of topic, we'll see that it also comes to be a lot about literature. Okay, so I'm going to now move into the reading aloud section, where we will read a good portion of this chapter to come back and reflect on it. So this is page 19 that we're beginning from, and section 2 in particular is where we're starting. Sorry. Okay. Here we go. It has often been pointed out that the increasing tempo of artistic change since Romanticism and the conquest of power by the middle classes involves a modification of the functional value of the new within the artistic process. Novelty is now felt to be not a relatively secondary and natural byproduct, but rather an end to be pursued in its own right. Now, knowledge of the innovation of the past furnishes a new kind of stimulus for the construction of the individual works themselves, so that technical revolutions, such as that of Schoenberg, must henceforth be read on two levels. Not only as one more moment in that gradual and autonomous evolution of material which has characterized the whole history of music, but also and above all, is an object lesson in a peculiarly modern phenomenon. The attempt to think your way through sheer formal invention into the very future of history itself. The evolution of musical sound may therefore initially be understood against the background of the aging of musical effects in general, which have, as it were, their own inner life, know their moment of maturation, and suffer debility and ultimately a kind of natural death. The common triad, for instance, struck the ear of the earliest listeners with an intensity which it will never again possess. And for us, such sounds, which were originally heard in the context of a polyphonic system, and as the triumph of tonal harmony over it, are henceforth nothing but insipid consonants in a world in which the cause of harmony has long since been won, and its initial audacities long since become commonplace. In much the same way, we can speak of something like a progress in the history of writing, one which, however, is less a matter of individual stylistic innovation than the habits of the reading public, to be gauged against the sheer quantity of words with which a given historical environment is saturated. It is clear, for instance, that a few bare names and plain nouns, a minimum of description, had a suggestive value for the readers of earlier centuries that they now no longer possess, in that overexposure to language which is characteristic of our own time. Thus, style resembles the Red Queen, developing ever more complicated mechanisms in order to sustain the power to say the same thing. And in the commercial universe of late capitalism, the serious writer is obligated to reawaken the reader's numbed sense of the concrete through the administration of linguistic shocks, by restructuring the overfamiliar, or by appealing to those deeper layers of the physiological, which alone retain a kind of fitful, unnamed intensity. In the musical realm, of course, the problem of the intensity of effects at a given historical moment may be described in positive or negative terms, inasmuch as the continuing value of the given system of consonants is at one with the effects of the dissonances that obtain within it, as well. Yet these effects, as Adorno shows us, largely transcend the musical scheme of things, to the degree to which dissonance as such has symbolic social value, comparable to, quote, the role which the concept of the unconscious plays throughout the history of middle-class ratio, end quote. The transgression of the consonant therefore functions, quote, from the very outset as the disguised representation of everything that has had to be sacrificed to the taboo of order. It substitutes for the censored instinctual drive, and includes as tension a libidinal moment as well, in its lament over enforced renunciation, end quote. This is all from Adorno's Philosophie der Neuen Musik. Thus, the Wagnerian diminished seventh, at its inception, expressed unresolved pain and sexual longing, the yearning for ultimate release, as well as the refusal to be reabsorbed into bland order. Yet having grown familiar and tolerable over the years, it now stands as a mere period sign of feeling or emotiveness, as a manner rather than a concrete experience of negation. Such absorption and accommodation of repressed material has of course always been one of the social functions of art. Yet at the same time of Wagner, it undergoes a modification, not unrelated to the shift in the role of innovation described above. For where in the past dissonance had existed only in order to confirm and ratify more strongly the positive tonal order on which it depended, now its character as, quote, self-glorifying subjectivity, end quote, and as protest against the social instance and its normative laws, tends to become an end in itself. Starting with a quote, all energy is now invested in dissonance. By comparison, the individual resolutions become even thinner, mere optional decor or restorative asseveration. Tension becomes the fundamental organizing principle to the degree that the negation of the negation, the utter cancelling out of the debt of each dissonance, is as in some gigantic credit system indefinitely postponed, end quote. This is from a different essay of Adorno's Versuch über Wagner. In a later chapter, we shall see that this phenomenon is to be seen against the background of that vaster repression of the negative in present-day society, of which Adorno's colleague Herbert Marcuse is the leading theoretician. It manifests itself in the literary realm by the increasingly antisocial character of the greatest works, and by the accompanying attempt on the part of society to reabsorb and neutralize the impulses they release. Thus, in Beyond Culture, Lionel Trilling has underscored the contradiction between the institutionalization of such modern classics by the American university and the profoundly subversive spirit of the works themselves, which originate in a refusal and a negation of just such institutionalization in the first place. That the work of Schoenberg is deeply marked by this situation may be judged by the disproportionate place of both positive and negative in it. Absolute freedom, violent liberation from harmonic constraint, in what may be called his expressionistic or atonal period, and renewed order, the self-imposed rigidities of the 12-tone system, which involves compulsions far beyond anything dreamed of in that tonal order which Schoenberg first abolished and then replaced. Yet both moments can, in the long run, be understood only in the context of the concrete historical situation, in the light of that regression of hearing in the modern world in general, where, bathed in the very element of debased sound and canned music from one corner to the other of the civilized universe, we tend to adjust our perceptions to the level of their object, with the resultant deterioration in that ability to listen with which the composer must work. So, it is now that we hear not the notes themselves, but only their atmosphere, which becomes itself symbolic for us. The soothing or piquant character of the music, its blueness or sweetness, is felt as a signal for the release of the appropriate conventionalized reactions. The musical composition becomes mere psychological stimulus or conditioning, as in those airports or supermarkets where the customer is orally tranquilized. The musical accompaniment has moreover become intimately linked in our minds with the advertising of products, and continues, in both popular and classical music alike, to function as such long after the advertisement is over. At this point, the sounds advertise composer or performer and stand as signs for the pleasure about to be derived from the product, so that the work of art sinks to the level of consumer goods in general. Compare in this regard the subliminal role of music in the movies, as a means of guiding our consumption of the plot, with the relationship of score to narrative in opera as an art form. And when, after this, we recall the high technical quality of present-day commercial composition in general, we begin to understand the destructive effect of such background music on the inherited concert repertoire, vast portions of which are eroded and emptied of their intrinsic vitality without our so much as realizing that it had ever been otherwise. In this situation, therefore, the new and the older sense is not enough. Art no longer has to do with a change in taste, resulting from the succession of the generations alone, but with one intensified and raised to the second power by a new commercial exploitation of artistic techniques in every facet of our culture. The new music must come to terms not only with our hearing, as did the old, but with our non-hearing as well. Hence, concrete music, which seeks to transform the unconscious contents of our daily perceptual life, the unheard oral stress of the industrial city, into a conscious object of perception. Hence, the willed ugliness of modern music in general, as if in the state of pathological hebetude and insensibility, only the painful remained as a spur to perception. The parallel with language is only too clear, and it is enough to evoke the fad for rapid reading and the habitual conscious or unconscious skimming of newspaper and advertising slogans for us to understand the deeper social reasons for the stubborn insistence of modern poetry on the materiality and density of language, on words felt not as transparency, but rather as things in themselves. So also in the realm of philosophy, the bristling jargon of seemingly private languages is to be evaluated against the advertising copybook recommendations of clarity as the essence of good writing. Whereas the latter seeks to hurry the reader past his own received ideas, difficulty is inscribed in the former as the sign of the effort which must be made to think real thoughts. It is not only our hearing that is affected, but also the works themselves. In strict correlation with our own fitful attention, our lowered capacity for concentration, our absent-mindedness and general distraction, the work of art suffers distortion, is broken down and fetishized. The whole comes to be replaced by the part, and instead of perceiving music as an organized structure, we are content to hear it while doing something else, just as long as we can salute the principal melodies and themes in passing. What was once a complete and continuous discourse has become an indistinguishable blur, intermittently illuminated by vulgar theme songs, motifs that have crystallized into objects and tokens like cliches in speech. Our emotion comes to be magically invested in these entities. They are the source of a purely subjective pathos, which has nothing to do with the original integral work itself, but which is rather a result of its disintegration and of the absence of any whole response. No wonder, therefore, that modern music is so unmelodious, so resolutely unlyrical, so suspicious of the illusions of individual subjectivity and of the song in which it is supposed to affirm itself. It is this breakdown of extended form in general to which the expressionistic music of Schoenberg is a memorial, a reaction against the idea of a completed work of art, a refusal of the very possibility of the self-sufficient masterpiece existing in and for itself. With the disappearance of the organizational value of the form as a whole, the surface of the work is shattered and no longer presents an unbroken and homogeneous appearance, or Schein in German, no longer stands complete and suspended, as it were, over against the world, but rather falls into it, becoming one object among others. Thus, the musical work loses its most fundamental precondition, that autonomous time in which the themes live as in an element of their own, in which they were able to develop according to their own internal laws, in that thorough interaction with each other, that leisurely drawing out of all the formal consequences known to aesthetics as Spiel. The shattering of the tonal framework frees the individual notes themselves from what had previously given them meaning. For the note, essentially a neutral and non-signifying element like the phoneme in speech, derived its functional value as an intention, whether as consonance or dissonance, continuation in a given key or modulation towards some new one, from the overall system itself. So in tonality, the mind held a kind of musical past and future together, whereas in the new atonal universe, the note exists only insofar as it is part and parcel of a musical statement in the present. The new form must remain almost physically in touch with all of its components at any given moment. Atonality is a kind of musical nominalism. Now, therefore, the part has become the whole, and the themes become the music itself, which is over when they are over. So that the work shrink alarmingly, and the revolutionary piano pieces that make up Opus 23 last only a few seconds apiece, each contained in a scant page of sheet music. And in this context, the next step would seem to be single notes and then silence. Thus, Webern may be seen as the logical completion of this tendency in early Schoenberg. Hence the term expressionism, for where the motifs involved no longer find a formal justification within the larger relational system of the work itself, they are obliged to be somehow self-justifying, pure expression, as autonomous and intelligible as a cry, an instant bounded by the limits of the mind's capacity to hold a single thought together. Such a situation places new stress on both listener and composer alike, for each of these works reinvents all of music within itself, like a speech each sentence of which would involve the simultaneous recreation of a new grammar to govern it. And what holds for the form is visible on the level of content as well. One of the most striking features of Schoenberg's early music is undoubtedly that fin de siècle neurosis style which he shares with the other Austrian artists of his period, and through which his world seems so profoundly akin to that of Freud. The thinly disguised sexual longing of Verklärte Nacht or Guerlieder, the monodrama of female hysteria, Erwartung, lead little by little to a new flood of unconscious material. Quote, "This is no longer the mimesis of passions, but rather the undisguised registration through the musical medium of bodily impulses from the unconscious, of shocks and traumas which assault the taboos of the form, inasmuch as the latter attempt to impose their censorship on such impulses, to rationalize them and to transpose them into images." Thus, Schoenberg's formal innovations were intimately related to the changes in the things expressed, and helped the new reality of the latter to break through to consciousness. The first atonal works are transcripts, in the sense of the dream transcripts of psychoanalysis. The scars of such a revolution in expression are, however, those blots and specks which as emissaries of the id resist the conscious will of the artist in both painting and music alike, which mar the surface and can as little be cleansed away by later conscious correction as the bloodstains in fairy tales. Real suffering has left them behind in the work of art as a sign that it no longer recognizes the latter's autonomy." End quote. That was all a quote from Adorno. Going on, thus the work of art during the expressionistic period would seem to be reduced to the status of testimony and symptom, of charts, graphs, X-ray plates. Yet what if the Freudian raw material, now thought of not so much as the elements of theory or scientific hypothesis, but rather as a peculiar type of content in its own right, dreams, slips of the tongue, fixations, traumas, the Oedipal situation, the death wish, were itself but a sign or symptom of some vaster historical transformation? In this context, the Freudian typology of the mental functions may be seen as the return of a new type of allegorical vision and as the disintegration of the autonomous subject, or of the cogito or self-governing consciousness in Western middle-class society. Now such characteristically Freudian phenomena are no longer seen as permanent mental functions, awaiting throughout human history their discovery and revelation by Freud, but rather as new events of which Freud was at once contemporary and theorist. They mark indeed the gradual alienation of social relations and the transformation of the latter, social relations, into autonomous and self-regulating mechanisms, in terms of which the individual or independent personality is little by little reduced to a mere component part and, as it were, a locus of strains and taboos, a receiving apparatus for injunctions from all levels of the system itself. The former subject no longer thinks, he is thought, and his conscious experience, which used to correspond to the concept of reason in middle-class society, middle-class philosophy, becomes little more than a matter of registering signals from zones outside itself, either those that come from within and below, as in the drives and bodily and psychic automatisms, or from the outer circles of interlocking social institutions of all kinds. At the same time, the surviving remnant of the ego now falls victim to the illusion of its own continuing centrality. That which is no longer in itself continues to exist for itself, and the subject wrongly continues to assume that there exists some correspondence between its inner monadic experience and that purely external network of circumstances, economic, historical, social, which determines and manipulates it through mechanisms beyond the horizon of individual experience. In parentheses, it is at this point, of course, that the novel, as a meaningful identification between the individual and social dimensions, becomes to come apart at the seams as a form. Now that individual experience has ceased to coincide with social reality, the novel is menaced by twin contingencies. If it holds to the purely existential, to the truth of subjectivity, it risks turning into ungeneralizable psychological observation, with all the validity of mere case history. If, on the other hand, it attempts to master the objective structure of the social realm, it tends to be governed more and more by categories of abstract knowledge rather than concrete experience, and consequently to sink to the level of thesis and illustration, hypothesis and example, in parentheses. Yet atonality, however much it may testify to the loss of rational control in modern society, at the same time carries within itself the elements of a new kind of control, the requirements of a new order as yet still only latent in the historical moment. For whatever the will towards total freedom, the atonal composer still works in a world of stale tonality and must take his precautions with regard to the past. He must, for example, avoid the kind of consonance or tonal chord which would be likely to reawaken older listening habits, and to reorganize the music into noise or wrong notes. Yet this very danger is enough to awaken in atonality the first principle of a new law or order. For the taboo against accidentally tonal chords carries with it the corollary that the composer should avoid any exaggerated repetition of a single note, for fear such an insistence would ultimately tend to function as a new kind of tonal center for the air. It is necessary only to pose the problem of avoiding such repetition in a more formal way for the entire 12-tone system to show itself upon the horizon. For ultimately the only logical solution is that of not repeating a given note until all of the other 11 notes of the scale have first been touched on, and with this the 12-tone row is born and replaces tonality. Henceforth, each work shall be composed not in a key, but in a particular and unique row, or arrangement of all 12 notes of the scale, devised for it alone, so that in a sense, the 12-tone work is nothing more than an immense theme and variations within the individual row as a theme, a repetition over and over again of the same series of 12 notes, but this time in either the horizontal or vertical direction. For the new system has the merit of abolishing one of the most ancient and fundamental contradictions in music, that between harmony and counterpoint, between the vertical and the horizontal, between the traditions of a massive orchestral sonority on the one hand, and those which appeal back to a rather archaic polyphony, with its fugues and canons on the other. Hitherto, it is as though there had existed mutually exclusive vertical and horizontal types of perception, which had alternated in a kind of gestalt-like interference with each other, obliging the listener to choose between two hearings of a given superposition of sounds, either as a momentary intersection of voices in movement, or as the massive intertwining of harmonic levels in a chord structure. Now, in the seething texture of Schoenberg's mature works, this opposition is abolished, and the row, which may at first have resembled an intricate, lengthy, highly articulated theme or melody, also serves, like some elaborate and complex molecule, as the building block for the vertical dimension of the score. Thus, the 12-tone system serves as a kind of unified field theory for music, in which the data of harmony and that of counterpoint can now be translated back and forth into each other. And with this, other inherited dilemmas are solved as well. Henceforth, no element is too small to require its place in the overall scheme of things, no detail too insignificant to be made to furnish its credentials and to embody a meaning. Such relatively traditional matters as instrumentation are, for example, now codified, so that in the notion of Klangfarbenmelodie, a given succession of instrumental timbres, such as the sequence violin, trumpet, piano, takes on the functional value of a sequence of notes and melody. Thus there is carried to completion in the musical realm that basic tendency of all modern art in general toward a kind of absolute overdetermination of all its elements, toward an abolition of chance, a kind of total absorption of the last remnants of sheer contingency in the raw material, which are henceforth painfully assimilated into the structure of the work itself. In parentheses, in the form of the novel, this evolution follows a rigorous and exemplary internal logic. The earliest realistic novels justify their contingent elements, descriptions, historical background, choice of particular subjects such as the life of a soap manufacturer or a doctor, on the purely empirical grounds that such phenomena already exist in the world around us, and that they therefore need no justification. With Zola, however, this empirical, purely descriptive motivation is joined by a second one, which rises oddly behind it, like the symptom formation of a repressed impulse. This is the tendency to turn such facts, which seem to have no intrinsic self-justifying meaning in themselves, into symbols or grossly materialized pictures of meanings. Thus, it is as if the mind, unable to bear the sheer contingency of this empirical reality, instinctively reckoned into such phenomena that unconscious, mythical, symbolic dimension which it denied them on the conscious level. Finally, with Joyce's Ulysses, which seemed at the time so naturalistic and conclusive a slice of life, this impulse has become a conscious intention, and the literary materials lead a double life on two separate levels, that of empirical existence and that of a total relational scheme, not unlike the 12-tone system itself, where each empirical fact is integrated into the whole, each chapter dominated by some basic symbolic complex, the motifs of the work related to each other by complicated charts and cross-references, and so forth, in parenthesis. So that whole paragraph is in a parenthesis. Thus, in a situation where subjective and objective have begun to split apart, Schoenberg's originality was to have driven the subjective and expressionistic to its outer limit, to the point at which the nerve pictures and traumata of the latter slowly veer under the pressure of their own internal logic into the new objectivity, the more total order of the 12-tone system. The specificity of the solution may be better gauged against the diametrically opposed one of Stravinsky, who may be thought of as having worked out from the other objective pole of the modern dilemma. For already the privileged form in which Stravinsky works, the ballet, may be seen as a kind of applied music, which even more drastically than the program music that is contemporary with it, reinvents a kind of distance between content and form within a medium that is otherwise non-representational. Thus, it is able to avoid the problems of self-justification and self-determination faced by pure music and resolved by Schoenberg in the way described above. For its musical practice, as it were, already justified by the visual tableau itself, and after the fact by the physical movements of the dancers, would ratify it, and of which it comes to seem the accompaniment. And what happens to the form of these works is reproduced on the level of content itself, particularly in the Russian ballets. Both Petrushka and The Rite of Spring dramatize the sacrifice of individual subjectivity to an inhuman collectivity, and their deliberate primitivism, with its appeal to folk culture in Petrushka or L'Histoire du Soldat, and with its elemental, archaic, well-nigh prehistoric rhythms in The Rite of Spring, solicit the regression of their sophisticated listener/spectator toward a kind of sacrifice of the intellect and the sheer emotionalism of mass response. This ultra-sophisticated primitivism, or musical demagoguery, Adorno will go as far to compare it as a phenomenon to fascism, is inscribed in the technique of the works themselves, which, as opposed to the total organizational principles of Schoenberg, favors a kind of massive and discontinuous verticality. Its ritualistic beats and repetitions are broken by lapses and silences, which create a syncopation with the returning shock waves of the listener's bodily reactions. Unlike Schoenberg, Stravinsky organizes the elements involved according to categories extrinsic to the musical structure, such as the isolated colors or qualities of the instruments themselves, or the psychological effects of their oppositions, loud and soft, piercing or massive. To be sure, Stravinsky, and particularly the Stravinsky of the early ballets, is as influential and primal a musical phenomenon as Schoenberg himself, but it is instructive to compare the respective historical situations from which the innovations of each composer derived, and in particular, quote, those Russian characteristics of Stravinsky which have been so often and abusively stressed, end quote. Starting a new quote, it has often been observed that Mussorgsky's songs are distinguished from German Lieder by the absence in them of a poetic subject or organizational point of view, each poem being treated as the composer of operas does his arias, not as an immediately subjective expression, but rather as a kind of objectification and instantiation of whatever whatever emotion is involved. The artist thus fails to coincide with the lyrical subject. The category of the subject was nowhere near so solidly established in pre-middle class Russia as in the Western countries, whence the alienness of a Dostoevsky, for instance, which stems from the lack of identity of the ego with itself. None of the brothers Karamazov is a character in the sense of Western literature. Now, this pre-individuality stands the late capitalist Stravinsky in good stead in his legitimation of the collapse of the individual subject, end quote. So that was all Adorno. Back to Jameson. His modernness is therefore the result of a kind of optical illusion, of a historical paradox in which pre- and post-individualism seem to meet, and are distinguished only by the deeper motivations at work beneath the surface. Thus, where Schoenberg's expressionism was designed as a shock absorber for the unconscious material, and ultimately as a means of mastering and assimilating it to the form, Stravinsky's aim is to reproduce such effects directly as psychic events by assault on the nerve ends of his audience. The value and direction of Stravinsky's artistic practice may be judged ultimately by the long series of neoclassical pastiches which succeed the Russian period. For here the bias towards musical objectivity may be openly observed at work in the way in which composer announces his own voice, abdicating that personal style which has become problematic in modern times, and speaking through the fossilized subjectivity of dead composers, in a kind of witty stylistic masquerade, reviving ghostly forms from a past where musical composition was still relatively free of internal contradictions. Thus Stravinsky's way ends in sterile imitation, in the writing of music about music, Palestrina with wrong notes, as someone has said. And indeed, in some ultimate squaring of the circle, we find him composing in the 12-tone idiom itself, and taking his metaphysical adversary, Schoenberg, as his final avatar. In parentheses, in literature, the theoretical justification for use of such pastiche and parody has been made by Thomas Mann, for whom the act of speaking with irony through a dead style permits speech in a situation where it would otherwise be impossible. Joyce, once again, embodies an exemplary progress from a derivative personal style, showing period affinities with Walter Pater, through the multiple pastiches of Ulysses, towards something which transcends both style and pastiche altogether, and which, like the 12-tone system in the musical realm, may stand as a distant representation of some future linguistic organization of a post-individualistic character. End parenthesis. It should not, however, be thought that Adorno finds Schoenberg's ultimate solution any less inherently contradictory in the long run than that of Stravinsky. How could it be otherwise, when the very inattention and authenticity of Schoenberg's music result from the way that it at one and the same time both reflects and refuses the historical moment of which it is the memorial? This is perhaps the point at which to say something about Adorno's conception of the relationship of the work of art to its immediate historical situation, where indeed he appears to bet on all sides at once, simultaneously adopting mutually exclusive alternatives or variations on the basic model. The work of art reflects society and is historical to the degree that it refuses the social. It represents the last refuge of individual subjectivity from the historical forces that threaten to crush it. Such is the position of that lecture on lyric and society, which is one of Adorno's most brilliant essays. Thus the socio-economic is inscribed in the work, but as concave to convex, as negative to positive. Ohne Angst leben. Such is for Adorno the deepest and most fundamental promise of music itself, which it holds even at the heart of its most regressive manifestations. On the other hand, the repeated characterization of Schoenberg's system as a total one deliberately underscores the relationship between that work and the totalitarian world in which it comes into being. For it is no less true that this drive toward a total organization of the work, which we find operative in the 12-tone system, is symptomatic of an objective tendency in the socio-economic structure of the modern world itself. Indeed, it is hardly surprising that this music, which finds its reason for being in a reaction against the debasement of hearing in general, should, as in a mirror image, develop all the strengths and weaknesses of its adversary, in a kind of point-by-point correlation. Inasmuch as that phenomenon is itself profoundly social and is at one with the commercialization of the modern world, modern music finds itself at once deeply implicated in a social struggle, without so much as straying from the internal logic of pure musical technique, and reproduces the structure of the alienated society in miniature in the intrinsic language of the musical realm. Thus, the total organizational principle of Schoenberg's system reflects a new systematization of the world itself, of which the so-called totalitarian political regimes are themselves only a symptom. For in the latter stages of monopoly or post-industrial capitalism, not only the multiplicity of small business units, but also distribution, and ultimately the last free-floating elements of the older commercial and cultural universe, are now assimilated into a single, all-absorbing mechanism. Now, when the entire business system, with its projections in government and in the military and judicial branches, depends for its very existence on the automatic sale of products which no longer correspond to any kind of biological or indeed social need, and which are moreover, for the most part, identical with each other, marketing psychology obliges it to complete its conquest of the world by reaching down into the last private zones of individual life, in order to awaken the artificial needs around which the system revolves. Thus, the total organization of the economy ends up by alienating the very language and thoughts of its human population, and by dispelling the last remnant of the older, autonomous subject or ego. Advertising, market research, psychological testing, and a host of other sophisticated techniques of mystification now complete a thorough planification of the public, and encourage the illusion of a lifestyle while disguising the disappearance of subjectivity in private life in the old sense. Meanwhile, what remains of the subjective, with its illusions of autonomy and its impoverished satisfactions, its ever-diminishing images of happiness, is no longer able to distinguish between external suggestion and internal desire, is incapable of drawing a line between the private and the institutionalized, and find itself therefore wholly delivered over to objective manipulation. Down to footnote 11. For the most comprehensive description of this process, see Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, Monopoly Capital. This new totalitarian organization of things, people, and colonies into a single market system is now duplicated by the planification of the work of art itself, whether in Joyce or in Schoenberg. The absolute conscious control which modern artists seek to establish over the last remnants of free-floating contingency reflects this increasing autonomy of institutions, this increasing conquest of both nature and society that they feel at work in the historical moment around them. It is no wonder then that Adorno's description of the relationship between art and society is ambiguous. The ambiguity had already been underlined in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, whose theoretical sections Adorno inspired, and where the life of the 12-tone composer Leverkuhn stands in sharp allegorical parallel to the disintegration of Weimar Germany and its passage into fascism. By which Thomas Mann meant to emphasize not the evil of modernism, after the fashion of a Wyndham Lewis, but rather the nature of tragedy in modern times. The possession of man by historical determinism, the intolerable power of history itself over life and over artistic creation, which is not free not to reflect what it reacts against. Let me read that last phrase again, which is not free not to reflect what it reacts against. In such a way, the contradictions of the age re-enter the microcosm of the work of art and condemn it to ultimate failure also. Thus the system of Schoenberg, the product of an inhumanly systematized society, becomes itself a kind of straitjacket, a constraint rather than a liberating convention. The row does not replace tonality after all, but only sets itself to imitating it, and instead of evolving new forms, the new music returns to the composition of sonatas in 12 tones. But the old forms represented a triumph over the resistance of things, the result of a kind of stubborn logic in their raw material. These new ones are as distant from nature as the post-industrial universe itself. Their matter is preformed and is lacking in any genuine internal logic as plastic. Nor is the identification of vertical with horizontal rarely achieved, but only willed. Its symbol would appear to be that massive chord of all 12 tones, which ends Berg's Lulu in a kind of blank indistinction or deathly synthesis of all the elements. Finally, the listener's ability to hear cannot be fully regenerated, and the concrete experience of the simultaneity of the whole and its parts is no longer possible in modern times. The most successful audition of a work by Schoenberg yields not a plenitude, but rather a kind of shadow work, an optical illusion in which the whole somehow floats above the concrete parts, not really at one with any of them in any given moment, in which the parts themselves flee hearing and extend beyond the present, are disassociated from the physical notes, through which they are expressed, and rise beyond them as a kind of blur or image superimposed. The distorted result of an attempt to imagine wholeness in a period that has no experience of it, under circumstances that doom the attempt to failure from the very start. Okay, end of section. So in this section, we are seeing Jameson's analysis of a lot of Adorno's work, basically. He does focus on Adorno's analysis in philosophy of the new music, but he mentions a couple of other comments by Adorno as well, and he's really looking at what Adorno sees in these particular composers that we've talked about. So while Beethoven wasn't mentioned in the section that we just read, Beethoven was referred to in just before this section that we started as the figure of a certain kind of sonata, of a certain kind of accordance with tonality that is associated with this triad and having a tonal center. So having a tonal center basically means it sounds like it's all in the same key, roughly, and the whole piece progresses around being in that same key. There is an idea of this common triad that is brought up here, and this common triad is really what is associated with that era of pieces with a tonal center, right? So here, Jameson says the common triad, for instance, struck the ear of its earliest listeners with an intensity with which it will never again possess. So the claim is that when Beethoven was composing and introducing these works with a tonal center, it had a different kind of historical signification and social signification than it does to us today, and than it would to contemporaries of Wagner or contemporaries of Stravinsky and Schoenberg. So in this sense, and this is something that Jameson stays fast to in his analysis of all of these different composers, One must put these composers in their historical situation to understand what their work is doing. Jameson is famously associated with this phrase, always historicize, and this is maybe one way of understanding what that always historicize means. We can't take a Beethoven piece, for example, listen to it today, and then expect to understand its role in and participation in the construction of a sort of reality unless we historicize it and think about what it was doing in that particular historical moment so many hundreds of years ago. So Jameson is doing this with Beethoven in talking about the sonata and talking about the fact that this common triad did have an intensity with its earliest listeners, but it lost that intensity as the ear was habituated to the common triad, right? So in Wagner's time and in Schoenberg and Stravinsky's time, and also I would expect in our time, this common triad is so familiar that works with a tonal center don't strike us with the same intensity that they would have a listener in Beethoven's time. Down here on the same page, Jameson is saying something similar in a different way, right? So there was a suggestive value of this common triad. He's actually talking about language here, but the analogy holds, is that certain ways of writing and language had a suggestive value for reader of the earlier centuries that they now no longer possess. Overexposure to language, which is characteristic of our own time. So thus the style resembles the Red Queen. The Red Queen here being a figure in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, I believe, who represents chaos and kind of developing complexity in some sort of way. I mean, the description is here, developing ever more complicated mechanisms in order to sustain the power to say the same thing. So the Red Queen might be a measure of a sort of authority that wants to sustain its authority by continually changing itself, by continually creating new complex mechanisms in order to stay the same, in order to stay in power. So this is the first point, that there is a idea of historicity, let's call it, or let's call it historicization, that Jameson is doing with each of these composers. So the work of each of these composers needs to be historicized. Beethoven's common triad is historicized in this sense, where it doesn't have the same force that it has today. And as we'll see, Wagner and Schoenberg and Stravinsky's work also needs to be historicized. We also on this page have the introduction of the analogy to literature that I introduced at the beginning here. So while we are talking about music, in a way throughout this whole section, there is this specter in the background that is literature that is always working in co-construction with what Jameson is reading out of Adorno's points in music. So the construction of many paragraphs, as we saw, which are often in parentheses, are to say something similar was going on in literature, or we can see a similar development in literature. And we could read this as a version of the idea of a footnote or of an aside or of a heroic simile, the work that a heroic simile is doing, where the dialectical method must continually take itself out of the main subject, must interrupt itself almost in order to work. Because the dialectical method supposes that reality is not one fixed thing. Reality is not something that you can syllogistically, right? We saw this word in the last section, syllogistically dictate, where you say this reason, this reason, this reason, now we have an answer. Reality is something that must be dialectically generated through movement, and that movement must be analogistic. It must work between different images which co-construct an idea of the same thing. So Jameson here is working with the idea of, or extending the idea of heroic simile. Aeneas did this thing just as if he were a wolf, to the whole analysis of Adorno's critique of the culture industry and literature, right? Adorno is critiquing music just as if this person in literature was doing this, or something along these lines. So we see this working throughout the chapter. Not the chapter, sorry, the section. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about here is the introduction of psychoanalytic language that Jameson is bringing in. So there's quite a bit of this, and we see the figure of Freud directly appear. We have seen the suggestion of this up here, as we commented in our last session, through the introduction of terms that a certain reader would necessarily associate with psychoanalysis. But here we get Jameson really showing his stripes in terms of understanding dialectical reality and the dialectical method as having something really serious to do with psychoanalysis and Freud's method. So I'm just going to go through the terms that are introduced here, and then we'll talk about the dimension in which they are used and what they might mean in relation to Jameson's argument. So the first one here is on this page that we're looking at, where we have the idea of taboo, right? And it's not it's a very specific framing of the idea of taboo, which is to say everything that has had to be sacrificed to the taboo of order. So order itself is a taboo, or order itself implies something to do with taboos. Okay, the next set of language that I want to talk about here is this dimension between the unconscious and the conscious that we're seeing at work at the top of this page. So here, Jameson is talking about concrete music and art. Art no longer had to do with a change in taste. This is the bottom of the page, resulting from the succession of generations alone, but to do with the commercial exploitation of artistic techniques as well. Hence, concrete music, which seeks to transform the unconscious contents of our daily perceptual life, the unheard oral stress of the industrial city, into a conscious object of perception. So there is this idea that Jameson's introducing that art and the art object has something to do with this dynamic between the unconscious and the conscious. Okay, let's keep going to get all of the different language so that we can take them all in turn. Okay, the next is down the bottom of the page here, where Jameson is talking about the striking features of Schoenberg's music, which is the thinly disguised sexual longing of these two particular works, where the monodrama of female hysteria is represented. And then he has this quote from Adorno, where Adorno is saying, this is no longer the mimesis of passions, but rather the undisguised registration through the musical medium of bodily impulses from the unconscious, of shocks and traumas which assault the taboos of the form. So there is a relationship between the unconscious and taboos, and the way that the taboos of the form here is maybe slightly different from taboos of order, but there is a way in which the unconscious makes its presence felt in the conscious, and this has something to do with taboos, seems to be the suggestion. There are these shocks that assault the bodily impulse, and these works in particular have a sexual longing that has to do with female hysteria. So we'll just put down hysteria and sexual longing. Okay. Here on page 27, we get a direct introduction of psychoanalysis as an analogy, right? In the same sense of how we were talking about literature as an analogy for music. So one has to be careful to pay attention to the analogies in Jameson's work because they are not incidental. They are an important part of the method. And the analogy here is that the first atonal works, so the atonal works, you'll remember, is how we are characterizing this kind of progression here from Wagner to Schoenberg and Stravinsky. They are reacting against, or they're departing from the tonality that is associated, the tonal centers that are associated with Beethoven, and are instead trying to develop a sort of atonality. So the analogy is that the first atonal works are transcripts in the sense of the dream transcripts of psychoanalysis, the scars of such a revolution in expression, those blots and specks which as emissaries of the id resist the conscious will of the artist in both painting and music alike, which mar the surface and can as little be cleansed away by later conscious correction as the blood stains in fairy tales. So the dream transcripts here, let's go back to the same color. Dream transcripts here are central to the psychoanalytic method, right? Where the psychoanalytic method, though it may also be other things, is an analysis of dreams because it sees in dreams not incidental moments that need to kind of be washed away or that we need to forget about or repress or something like this in order to get better. It seems in dreams a breaching of the boundary between the unconscious and the conscious. How exactly that works is complicated and requires maybe more psychoanalytic theory than we need here, but it seems something importantly essential to the way that the human subject is constructed in these dreams. The dreams, the retelling of these dreams, cannot be scraped away by conscious correction. They can as little be cleansed away as the blood stains in fairy tales, right? There is real suffering in these dreams. So atonal works are like dreams, is the suggestion here. This is then generalized in the next sentence to say the work of art during the expressionistic period would seem to be reduced to the status of testimony and symptom. Yet what if the Freudian raw material, now thought of not so much as the elements of theory, but rather as peculiar type of content, were itself but a sign or symptom of some vaster historical transformation? So the work of art itself is read as a kind of symptom. Not a straightforward symptom, Jameson wants to say, but something, a more sort of fundamental symptom. In this context, the Freudian topology of the mental functions may be seen as the return of a new type of allegorical vision and as the disintegration of the autonomous subject, of the cogito or self-governing consciousness in Western middle-class society. So, for Jameson, all of this stuff about Freud, the unconscious, dreams, etc., has something to do with the subject, certainly, and the subject in modern society in particular. And there is this interesting historical lining that Jameson seems to be introducing here between a subject or a listener who was impacted by Beethoven's sonatas, who heard that intensity in Beethoven's sonatas, and the subject or listener who becomes habituated to those and therefore needs the shock of atonality, the atonality of Wagner, Schoenberg, and Stravinsky, to recognize something about themselves. So I frame that sentence in a purposefully labyrinthine kind of way, because we're not sure yet what Jameson is saying about the analysis of music, or what he seems to think Adorno is reading of the structure of the subject in these musical developments. But what's important here is that there is something detailed and fundamental about the structure of the subject and its development over time in the innovations in classical music in particular. And psychoanalysis is one of the ways in which Jameson is trying to understand that connection. Okay, so let's come now to this next section where all of this psychoanalytic vocabulary is kind of put to work on page 28. At the top of page 28, Jameson is here talking about the gradual alienation of social relations and the transformation of social alienations into autonomous and self-regulating mechanisms, in terms of which the individual or independent personality is reduced to a mere component part and, as it were, a locus of strains and taboos, a receiving apparatus for injunctions from all levels of the system itself. The former subject no longer thinks, he is thought. And his conscious experience, which used to correspond to the concept of reason in middle-class philosophy, becomes little more than a matter of registering signals and zones from outside itself. Here we get some more psychoanalytic vocabulary that I forgot to highlight. The drives, as in the drives in bodily and psychic automatisms, or from the outer circles of interlocking social institutions of all kinds. So we have this idea of the drive as mediating some of these terms. So what is Jameson saying about the subject here? And why is psychoanalysis the way in which Jameson wants to talk about it? So I want to bring back one of those key dialectical oppositions, which is the subject and the object. The subject, in a very straightforward and simple way of thinking the subject, is this transcendental idealized subject of one who thinks, right? This subject is associated with philosophers like Descartes and Kant, because Descartes and Kant were both interested in different ways in finding the part of thought, of thought that they called reason, that they could rely on in their experience of the world, right? Descartes and Kant find this kind of foundation for thought in different places, but they're both fundamentally interested in finding a foundation in thought itself for the subject. And so this tradition of understanding the world through thought and thinking about how thought is powerful in the world is associated with the subject side of the dyad and is called idealism often. The object is what is not a part of the subject, right? It's an opposition to the subject, yet as we stressed at the beginning, it has a dialectical relationship to the subject, or at least it does in the method in which Jameson, the philosophical method and tradition in which Jameson is working. The object, if the subject is associated with a tradition called idealism, then the object is associated with a tradition called materialism, right? And the materialist, a certain kind of crude materialist tradition, would insist that the subject, as in the thoughts that we produce as individuals, are not actually of our own making in some strict way. There isn't anything that we can do about what we think, because our thoughts, this crude materialist position would have it, are just productions of the world around us, right? We as individuals are just productions of everything that exists in the world around us. And this kind of materialism is associated with various thinkers in philosophy, but I'm going to put Foucault there as someone who talked about power and the way in which individuals are just articulations of a particular arrangement of power, right? So on the far side of on the object side of the dyad, the subject is nothing but a production of the objects around it, right? Whereas on this side of the dyad, the object is actually nothing but a production of the subject's thoughts, because the subject is fully autonomous, is the right word, in thinking about the world around it. And this far side of subjectivity has also come to be called things like postmodernity and relativism, or let's put relativism there. Everything is relative. My interpretation is as good as your interpretation. It's just a different matter of how we cognize things, right? Cognition is the difference in the world, and all the difference in the world is in cognition. So, what does this dyad, the subject-object, have to do with Freud and psychoanalysis? The subject in modern society, Jameson seems to be suggesting, is both subject and object in these, or has aspects of both the subject and the object, right? But Jameson, in this section that we just read, strongly wants to resist polarizing the position of the subject either too far to that subject side or too far to that object side. He says, the surviving remnant of the ego now falls victim to the illusion of its own continuing centrality. That which no longer is in itself continues to exist for itself, and the subject wrongly continues to assume that there exists some correspondence between its inner monadic experience and that purely external network of circumstances which determines and manipulates it through mechanisms beyond the horizon of individual experience, right? So this is the key question. Are we as subjects just productions of our objective circumstances, or do our thoughts actually have some sort of impact on the world? Freud is an important mediator of this debate because Freud has a more nuanced take, or comes to have a more nuanced take, on the polarization between subject and object, or the positions of the subject and the object. Freud says we are neither subject nor are we object in this sense, but there is a bit of both in the mix. And this taboo of order that we heard about, and the idea of dreams, and the unconscious, crucially, are one way of reading how Freud problematizes this far right side of full objectivity in the equation that we've drawn up here. Because what happens in dreams, Freud comes to think, is not entirely a production of what happened to us throughout our day, right? There isn't full determinate connection where one can say, I had this dream because I was thinking about this during the day, and these were the past occurrences in my life, and all of these things kind of added up in a full causal chain to make the production of my dream perfectly sensible. There was nothing contingent in my dream. It was all necessary, would be the philosophical language. It was all causally related to something that came before it. And one could, in theory, this position would say, draw the full set of connections that produced my dream. It just happens that I aren't able to draw that full set of connections, right? This is a full materialist position because it sees cause as fully explainable in the world. There is always a cause that can be traced for a particular thing. The dream and the unconscious and the taboo, what these places represent or come to represent in Freud's philosophy of the subject-object dialectic, are a sort of missing cause, right? There are some things that happen that can't obviously be traced to a cause. So this section down here, this parenthesized paragraph here, will hopefully make more sense when we read it now, where Jameson says, now that individual experience has ceased to coincide with social reality, the novel is menaced by twin contingencies. If it holds to the purely existential, to the truth of subjectivity, it risks turning into ungeneralizable psychological observation. So we're here talking about the work of art in relation to the subject and the object, right? The novel is the example here, but as we saw with the novel and the piece of music, there is a generalization that Jameson is doing across these two forms. So if the work of art is purely subjective, it's just purely created in the artist's mind and doesn't have anything to do with the objective reality in which the artist finds themselves, it risks turning into ungeneralizable psychological observation with all the validity of mere case history. So case history here is actually another psychoanalytic term, which evokes a kind of thing in psychoanalysis, which is the case history of a particular patient, right? The set of sessions that an analyst has had with an analysand, with a patient. And this case history is important, but the good analyst doesn't over-determine what the next session will be based on all of the previous sessions, because there is a possibility that there will be something that happens for the good analyst that is not traceable to this kind of network of causes that the analyst has built up as an image in their mind of the analysand. So Jameson saying, I don't want to go full subject on this, full left side, or Adorno doesn't want to go full subject on this. If, on the other hand, it attempts to master the objective structure of the social realm, that is, if the work of art is fully representative of the things in the social world, if it is fully kind of objectively produced, it tends to be governed more and more by categories of abstract knowledge rather than concrete experience, and consequently sink to the level of thesis and illustration, hypothesis and example. So there's a interesting dynamic there at work. If the work of art is interpreted as something that is fully objective, then it actually becomes more abstract, because it becomes like those mathematical scientific theories that try to generalize across all instances and therefore become a sort of operative symbolic system for explaining the world, right? This is why Jameson says here, sink to the level of thesis and illustration, hypothesis and example, because this kind of reality happens as it is, and the work of art's the work of art is just an interpretation of it, then the work of art actually gets more abstract because it must become this kind of scientific theory of what is happening that actually has nothing to do with a kind of concrete experience. So atonality here in this next paragraph is neither of these things, Jameson says. However much it may testify to the loss of rational control in modern society, however much it may be considered a production of objective forces in society and not something that is produced subjectively, it at the same time carries within itself the elements of a new kind of control, the requirements of a new order, yet still only latent in the historical moment. So it is not just an expression of an order that already exists, the work of art, Jameson says, the atonality as a case study in some sense for the work of art. It also carries an idea of a different order within it, which means that it must be something more than just pure objectivism. Because there is this specter of the ideal that haunts any sort of fully objectivist interpretation in these three terms that we had introduced of the past, the present, and the future. Right? So the work of art takes place in the present, but if it were fully on the objective side of things here, then it would be fully determined by the past, right? There would be no future, because the cause is fully traceable. There is nothing that goes missing, no missing cause. The present is fully determined by the past. This is what psychoanalytic language and what Jameson employs the psychoanalytic language calls overdetermination. If, on the other hand, we're fully on the subject side of the object dialectic, then let's actually use a different color for that. Sorry, my logic of coloration here is not particularly well considered, but let's call the subject side of here the red. If we're fully on the subjective side of interpretation, then there actually is no past, because the future is entirely determined by what we want to think next. Right? The past doesn't matter because the subject is fully autonomous, and the fact of what happened in my past has no bearing on what I want to think in the future in this purely subjective frame of mind. This, I'm going to forget the proper term for this in the psychoanalytic vocabulary. It might be hysteria. I could be wrong on that. But it is some sort of pathology with relation to one's place in the world and time, right? Because the past has no bearing on the future, which is not the case. So appreciating the dialectical structure of reality holds these two things in tension, and atonality as a work of art, Jameson suggests, testifies to both of these things, both the objective side of reality and the subjective side of reality. It holds both the past and the future in tension within the present. And I think we had this language earlier on. Yeah, so up the top of the page here, we have the music such as that of Schoenberg must be read on two levels. Not only as one moment in that gradual and autonomous evolution of material, which has characterized the whole history of music. So the autonomous evolution of material would suggest that that is on the subject side, right? Because it is evolving in its own space. It doesn't have anything to do with materiality, which has characterized the whole history of music, but also and above all as an object lesson in a purely modern phenomenon. So it has both parts of the subject and object in it. And that object lesson is the attempt to think your way through sheer formal invention into the very future of history itself, right? So this is Jameson's linguistic way or attempt of neither cancelling the past nor cancelling the future, of keeping this tension between, let's use green, keeping this tension between the subject and the object existing, and therefore having the very future of history itself, right? So the future of history itself. In the present, we might be able to change how the past means. There's this funny kind of circle going on here. So this green is what Jameson wants to suggest atonality in Schoenberg and Stravinsky's case is doing, and perhaps more generally the work of art should do as well. Yeah, so we get the same, just to give another example or another phrasing of Jameson's that we might be able to understand through the subject-object dialectic. So in tonality, the mind held a kind of musical past and future together, whereas in the new atonal universe, the note exists only insofar as it is part and parcel of a musical statement in the present. The new form must remain almost physically in touch with all of its components at any given moment. Atonality is a kind of musical nominalism. So this is actually at a stage where Jameson is interpreting Adorno as critiquing atonality as being too much on the subject side of this equation, right? That atonality is a musical nominalism because it sees music as being completely free of the past in this particular framing. He will go on to say, as we saw, that there is Adorno actually held out a more complicated valence for atonality, that it did have something of this dialectical structure of reality, but in this first interpretation, atonality is a bad thing in some sense because it is too subjective. Nominalism is on the subjective side of our diagram. Pure expression. Expressionism becomes self-justifying. Pure expression, autonomous and intelligible as a cry, an instant bounded by the limits of the mind's capacity to hold cynical thought together. Okay, here we get this the same language around overdetermination that I introduced just before. Thus, there is carried to completion in the musical realm that basic tendency of all modern art here being pejorative in some sort of sense. Jameson is saying modern art is not doing what the work of art should do. In general, towards a kind of absolute overdetermination of all its elements, towards an abolition of chance, a kind of total absorption of the last remnants of sheer contingency in the raw material, which are henceforth painfully assimilated into the structure of the work itself. So this interpretation of modern art is too much on the object side, right? There is an abolition of chance. That's a incredible phrasing. And the 12-tone system here, Jameson is saying, becomes a unified field theory for music. Unified field theory here referring to scientific theory that believes itself to express everything about the state of the world. It believes itself to be totally coherent, right? So the 12-tone system, atonality in one of its guises, becomes that abstract, rarefied, scientific description of events in the world that is produced when the interpretation of the work of art is too much on that objective side of the equation. And in this paraphrase in the parenthesized paragraph here about literature, Jameson compares this atonality that is too much on the objective side to Joyce's with Zola, right? Emile Zola, a novelist, where the empirical, purely descriptive motivation, this kind of enumeration of facts that his work seems to have no intrinsic self-justifying meaning in itself. It's just pure chaos because it doesn't have any causality. So there's this funny tension in the objective side of the equation where the attempt to exhaustively enumerate the cause of everything actually produces a kind of chaos because that attempt is always in vain. Right? This is sometimes the description given here, or the analogy given here, is sometimes Borges' map, or the attempt in one of Borges' novels for a character in the novel to map the entire world in full detail. Right? And the character realizes that this is impossible because to map the world in full detail would be to reproduce the world. To produce the world again. A map is a necessary distillation of things, a necessary kind of erasure of some things. And so the attempt to have a theory of everything actually flips over very quickly into a theory of nothing. And this is what Jameson is saying here about this literary analogy. Thus it is as if the mind, unable to bear the sheer contingency of this empirical reality, instinctively reckoned into such phenomena that unconscious, mythical, symbolic dimension, which it denied them on the conscious level. So the language of the unconscious and the conscious is at work there again, because the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious helps to navigate this kind of chaos of sheer contingency, right? We must repress some things in order to have any sort of conscious clarity. There must be the loss of some memories in order for any memory to actually form itself. If we remembered everything, if we felt everything at every time, there would be no clarity of expression or feeling at all. Because if I really felt everything that was going on in the air around me, I would never be able to feel pain in my leg or a change in some sort of thing, some sort of aspect of my experience. So there needs to be a loss of some kind of knowledge, some kind of information, and that knowledge, that information needs to transform into some other form. And Freud's theory of the unconscious and repression is one way of working through this. Okay, the last thing I wanted to comment about this section, obviously there's a lot more we could say about this section, but the last thing I wanted to comment before we go on is about the use of this term autonomy and how it relates to the subject-object divide in some sense. Let's go with orange. Okay, so autonomy we have come to see is a word that is a way of designating on which side of the subject-object dialectic something falls. In the case of this new totalitarian organization of things, people, and colonies into a single market system, not a good situation, obviously, in which is duplicated by the planification of the work itself. And we saw the planification here is this dispelling of the last remnant of the older autonomous subject or ego. So the transition from the autonomous subject and ego, the subject side of the equation, where the subject is not fully determined by all of its experience in the world, right? It has some sort of freedom. It can do some new things. It can imagine a future. It is not fully determined by its past. The total organization of the economy, Jameson says up here, ends up by alienating the very language and thoughts of its human population and by dispelling the last remnant of the older autonomous subject or ego. So autonomy sort of shifts from originally being placed in the subject to moving somewhere else. Where does that autonomy move? The autonomy being dispelled. It moves, Jameson says, down here through these kind of symptoms of the planification of the work of art itself, the single market system, the commodification of art, all of these things are related, whether in Joyce or in Schoenberg. The absolute, and this is another symptom, the absolute conscious control which modern artists seek to establish over the last remnants of free floating contingency, reflect this increasing autonomy of institutions. So the autonomy moves from the subject, from us as individuals, from our individuality. Our individuality is lost in some sense, and instead becomes an autonomy of institutions. Right? This is a very strange movement, because what is an institution but a collection of people? Right? People who have put down their wills in some sort of way to say, this is what we want this institution to do, and these are its imperatives. So how can an autonomy shift from the individuals to institutions? I'm not going to be able to explain that strange movement fully here, except to say that this shifting of the autonomy from the subject to institutions, to some sort of other place, is what results in what has come to be called alienation, right? This feeling of other, this feeling of otherness to yourself. And it is also, as that term suggests, a process that Marx is particularly interested in capital, right? For what is capital and capitalism if not an institution that has taken our autonomy away from us in some strange way? And strange here because Marx's analysis of capital is not to say there are these capitalists who are consciously doing these things and pursuing the accumulation of value at all of the proletariats and workers' expense. Marx's analysis in Capital is saying that there is something almost unconscious going on here, where both workers and capitalists think or imagine themselves to be free, to be doing good things, yet nonetheless these institutions form up that gather autonomy, and this results in alienation and a sort of negative state of affairs. So in talking about this movement of autonomy, Jameson is regretting or critiquing in some sense the new totalitarian organization of things. And this is his pejorative view on modern art and and what he will come to call, I think, postmodernism in a later book. And here he calls it the nature of tragedy in modern times, the possession of man by historical determinism, the intolerable power of history itself over life and over artistic creation. So life is given over to history and it becomes a sort of undead life. And then this really eloquent turn of phrase, the intolerable power of history over life and over artistic creation, where life and artistic creation, or life in particular, is not free not to reflect what it reacts against. So this double negative of it's not free, it is ensnared in a requirement to reflect what it does not want to be determined by, right? It is not free not to reflect what it reacts against. Thus, the system of Schoenberg, and this is atonality, the product of an inhumanly systematized society, becomes a kind of straitjacket, a constraint rather than a liberating convention. The listener's ability to hear cannot be fully regenerated, down the bottom here. The concrete experience of the simultaneity of the whole and its parts is no longer possible in modern times. So this is what Jameson is regretting. The dialectical perception of society is no longer possible in modern times. Okay. As I said, there's lots more we could say about that section, but in the interests of time, I'm going to move on to section 3. So switching back over to reading. Okay. We are thus led little by little to reflect on the connection between such a dialectical vision of historical change, in which the various moments are articulated according to the various possible relations between subject and object, and some hypothesis of a historical moment of plenitude or completion against which the other historical stages are judged and weighed. Such a moment is, of course, first and foremost nothing but a logical possibility, the concept of what Adorno calls Versöhnung, or reconciliation between the subject and objectivity, between existence and the world, the individual consciousness and the external network of things and institutions into which it first emerges. The naive projection of such a logical possibility into the realm of historical chronology can only result in metaphysical nostalgia, the golden age before the fall, the blissful state of primitive man, or in utopianism. Yet in some more subtle fashion, all so-called theories of history tend to organize themselves around the covert hypothesis of just such a moment of plenitude. Think of Jeffersonian America, or of the unity of sensibility of the metaphysical poets, of the humaneness of medieval economic doctrine, or of the organic continuity of an ancient regime unsullied by regicide or by the hubris of political self-determination, not to speak of the innumerable ideological exploitations of ancient Greece. In the cultural realm, however, where the essential working opposition between subject and object is transposed into terms of form and content, such hypotheses have perhaps greater validity and are in any case more verifiable. For if we are in no position to judge the concreteness of life at any given moment of the past, at least we can evaluate the adequacy of form to content in its cultural monuments, and are able to measure the reconciliation of intention and medium, and the degree to which all visible matter is form, and all meaning or expression concrete embodiment. So it is for Adorno. The work of Beethoven stands as a kind of fixed point against which earlier or later moments of musical history will be judged. It is, of course, not a question of degrees of genius, but rather of the inner logic of historical development itself, and of a kind of accumulation of formal possibilities of which Beethoven is the beneficiary, and which suddenly makes possible an unexpected carrying through to their conclusion of all the unfinished trends, a filling out of all the hitherto empty spaces, an actualization of the potentialities latent in the musical raw material itself. In musical terms, that unique reconciliation, which is Beethoven's historical opportunity, takes the form of a precarious equilibrium between melody and development, between a new and richer thematic expression of subjective feeling and its objective working through of the form itself, which no longer has anything of that relatively mechanical and a priori applied execution of 18th century music. For the sheer volume of the production of the great 18th century composers resulted in part from the presence to hand for them of relatively simple schemes and formulae of execution. Nor had orchestration yet become so complicated an individualistic affair. The court orchestras of feudal principalities do not yet have the variety of instruments, let alone the sheer technical virtuosity of the later middle-class stage orchestra. For all these reasons, the themes of the 18th century composers cannot be said to have achieved a genuine fullness of subjective being. A melody of Mozart is not yet self-sufficient and remains functionally conceived, bearing traces of the form of which it is an indivisible component. Nor, on the other hand, does the Beethoven melody ever reach that extreme autonomy and overripeness of those devised by the hypersubjective composers of the later 19th century. Let Tchaikovsky stand as their archetype, for whom the contrapuntal work is reduced to a bare minimum, the working through of themes to perfunctory and monetary repetition, and in whose work the center of gravity of musical invention moves to sheer instrumental expressiveness and orchestral coloration. Standing between these two extremes, the Beethoven melody represents a short-lived synthesis of the functional and the expressive. Lengthy and articulate, it presents the appearance of autonomy, while being at the same time shrewdly disposed and preformed with a view to the various developments, polyphonic or variational, which it is about to undergo. Reciprocally, the various sub-voices of the development are still relatively independent and intrinsically meaningful, which cannot be said for those of late Romanticism, and they have something individual and personal about them which distinguishes them from their rather schematic and mechanical equivalents in earlier music. Thus, subjectivity and the personal inform the score down to its smallest elements, but do so by working through the objective, suffusing and vivifying it, rather than by blotting it out and smothering it with the overwhelming harmonic and coloristic bias of later music. And what is true of the part holds, as we have already seen above, for the form as a whole, for the sonata as a short-lived possibility of meaningful organization on a large scale, in which the mind is momentarily able to glimpse a concrete totality, completely present at every instant of its unfolding. Even though there is no exact literary equivalent for Beethoven and what he represents in the history of Western music, literary judgments ultimately depend on the presuppositions about form and content described above. Thus, the privileged position of Tolstoy in the history of the novel proves on closer examination to have an analogous basis. The relatively late development of middle-class literature in Russia leaves the 19th century Russian novelist in a position of great freedom. Everything remains to be done in the area of Russian themes. There is not the oppressive fact of earlier generations of novelists and of shelves of novels that weighs on the successors of Balzac or Dickens. Yet these Russian novelists, by their very tardiness, are contemporary with all that is most sophisticated in novelistic technique, with Maupassant and the naturalists, so that the Russian realistic novel in general, and Tolstoy in particular, can be born fully grown. Technique elsewhere, laboriously acquired, can here seem flowing and natural, resulting in that peculiar and characteristic reconciliation between the subjective intention and the novel's objective social material, with which we associate with the name of Tolstoy, and in which both social and individual experience issue from the novelist's hand, as though equally his own creations. The dialectical structure of our negative judgments is even more apparent. Think of the grimace and caricature to which we object in Balzac. Is it anything more than a too hasty attempt to assimilate the objective social material, characters, furniture, institutions, to the personal enthusiasms of the author himself, imperiously deforming and distorting it for his own purposes? Think, on the other hand, of the rather metallic brittleness of Flaubert, which results from too rigid and surgical a suppression of the subjective dimensions of the work, until the hero becomes as vacuous as a recording eye in L'Education Sentimentale, and the work is finally, in Salammbô, degraded into cinematographic phantasmagoria. Think of the mannered quality of Henry James, those great pauses between meaningful half-sentences, the close-ups of small areas of objectivity in an attempt to infuse them with subjective intention, in the way a random word surrounded by a pregnant silence becomes ominous with meaning. Think of the precariousness of the synthesis of Joyce, in which matter once again seems momentarily reconciled with spirit, all the objects and detritus of the city luminous and as though informed by subjectivity, except that the seams show there is something willful and arbitrary about the relationship of the individual chapters to each other, and the new reconciliation is paid for as dearly as that of Schoenberg in music. The novel is always an attempt to reconcile the consciousness of the writer and reader with the objective world at large, so that it is the judgments we make on great novelists fall not on them, but on the moment of history, which they reflect and on which their structures pass sentence. There can therefore be no doubt that the privileged synthesis of Beethoven's work correspond to some peculiar freedom in the social structure of his time. Historical freedom, indeed, expanding and contracting as it does with the objective conditions themselves, never seems greater than in such transitional periods, where the lifestyle has not yet taken on the rigidity of a period manner, and when there is sudden release from the old without corresponding obligation to that which will come to take its place. The dominant figure of Napoleon himself is symbolic of the basic ambiguity of this moment, which follows the collapse of the feudal order in Europe and precedes the definitive setting up of the new ethical, political, and economic institutions of the middle classes which triumphed over it. He, Napoleon, combines something of the fading values of feudality and the sacred kinship with the frankly secular and propagandistic appeal of the charismatic political leaders of later middle-class society, yet at the same time can be assimilated neither to the bewigged absolute monarchs of the 16th and 17th century, nor to the demagogues of the 20th. Even the neoclassicism of the Napoleonic period is significant and points in two directions, for it seems to have been the last of the great continental styles which, Gothic or Renaissance, Baroque or Rococo, swept across Europe in successive waves, leaving a sediment of monuments behind them. While on the other hand, it is the first form of modernism as well, in that it is secretly pastiche, art about art, and registers the contradictions of the middle-class world through its own inner contradictions in a way that will be characteristic of every artistic movement to follow. Thus, Beethoven's reconciliation between the subjective and the objective faithfully registers the enlarged horizons of the revolutionary transition period itself, when the positive and universalistic thinking of the middle class during its struggle for power has not yet given way to the esprit de Céreau of money, business, and realpolitik. When the abstract idea of human freedom, whose optimism and heroics are eternalized in Fidelio, has not yet been transformed into an ideological defense of class privilege. And what is true for music holds for thought as well. Philosophy, freed from the long constraint of theology, has not yet undergone the positivistic reduction to scientific empiricism, has not yet abdicated its rights to such newly invented academic disciplines, such as sociology or psychology, let alone begun to question its own validity in the manner of 20th century logical positivism. At this point in history, thought is still out for the largest things, and it is to such a moment of possibility, to such a moment of suspension between two worlds, that the philosophy of Hegel is the most ambitious and profoundly characteristic monument. In the final chapter of the present work, we will try to redefine the role Hegelianism is called to play in a Marxist framework. The problem is clearly at one with the relationship between the values of the older middle class revolution and the revolutionary consciousness and needs of the present day. Yet it is at once evident that the very principle at work in dialectical analyses, which we have described above, that of the adequation of the subject and object, and of the possibility of reconciliation of I and not I, of spirit and matter, of self and world, is itself the very premise of Hegel's system, and may be claimed to be virtually Hegel's intellectual invention. For Hegel made concrete the merely abstract and empty affirmations of his predecessors that the objective external world is identical with that of spirit, and set out to demonstrate the multiplicity of ways in which such an identity is realized. From the objective point of view, the phenomenology of spirit is just such a demonstration of identity, showing how the most seemingly external or materialistic phenomena, such as objects of our sense perception and of our scientific research, are all informed with spirit, all profoundly involved with and penetrated by ideality. But from the subjective point of view, the phenomenology is the story of an ascent and a development, a description of the successive stages through which consciousness enriches and solidifies itself. From its most individualistic and subjectively limited moments, gradually arrives at the condition of absolute spirit, in which it learns that it ultimately includes within itself all the abundance and multiplicity of the external and objective universe. Hegel is able to overcome the separation between subject and object by finding his starting point in a moment when that separation has not yet taken place, in the moment of experience itself, where the subject, still at one with the object, has not yet attained self-consciousness, has not yet learned to distinguish itself as a separate and abstractly independent entity, has not yet been able to draw back and look across a void towards the separate, equally abstract entity of things in themselves. The dialectical method is precisely this preference for the concrete totality over the separate, abstract parts. Yet it is more complicated than any objective apprehension of a merely external kind of totality, such as takes place in the various scientific disciplines. For in these, the thinking mind itself remains cool and untouched, skilled but unself-conscious, and is able to forget about itself and its own thought processes, while it sinks itself wholly in the content and problems offered it. But dialectical thinking is a thought to the second power, a thought about thinking itself, in which the mind must deal with its own thought process just as much as with the material it works on, in which both the particular content involved and the style of thinking suited to it must be held together in the mind at the same time. The dialectical thinking through of a mathematical problem, for example, would involve, besides the awareness of the problem on its own terms, an implicit comparison between the way the mind felt performing the mathematical transaction and its feel during the experience of other entirely different scientific and non-scientific operations. Dialectical thought is therefore profoundly comparative in its very structure, even in its consideration of individual isolated types of objects, and the chapter sequence of the phenomenology is merely the objective working out of sets of comparisons already inherent in it. Yet comparison involves difference, and the movement from one chapter to another, from one form of consciousness to another, is that of a series of leaps, of a constant passage from one kind of raw material to another seeming unrelated to it. Indeed, the most striking aspect of the phenomenology for the modern reader is that it presents, to use the terminology of the novel, no unity of point of view. The transitions between the chapters are not necessarily equivalent to moments of growth and change in the life of an individual. The content of the various chapters is quite heterogeneous, some of it coming from collective or historical experience, some from individual or ethical, some relating to action, some to pure knowledge. Corresponding to these two structural irregularities, the attacks on the Hegelian system have tended to fall into two distinct groups. On the one hand, the existential objection to Hegel has always been that there is a vital difference between the knowing of a transition between two moments and the living of it. The salvation of the slave may lie in a stoicism, which will result in a whole new inner life for humanity. But the generations of individual slaves must die before the qualitatively new moment is achieved. Nor, on the other hand, is the phenomenology ultimately any more satisfying when examined from the objective point of view, where it seems to fall apart in a series of random observations and analyses, historical notes, psychological, philosophical, scientific, artistic data, which would have to be analyzed separately by the various disciplines and questions before their validity could be assumed. Yet these criticisms are based on our own historical vantage point. They presuppose the increasing intellectual specialization of the sciences in defining the various fields and methods, as well as a greater psychological awareness of the structure and value of individual life. They represent, therefore, not so much an intrinsic logical critique of Hegel as an almost physical discrepancy between his moment in time and our own, and it is this paradox which is at the center of Adorno's reading of Hegel. From our inability to realize the Hegelian vision of totality, it does not follow that this vision is not fuller and richer, more concrete than anything we can presently imagine. The impossibility of the Hegelian system for us is not a proof of its intellectual limitations, its cumbersome methods and theological superstructure. On the contrary, it is a judgment on us and on the moment in which we live, and in which such a vision of the totality of things is no longer possible. Just as the Beethoven sonata stood as the precarious synthesis of whole and part, so the philosophy of Hegel is one long tension between the organization of overall dialectic, with absolute spirit as the end result of the process, and the individual moments, the steps of the dialectic, the concrete analysis of the various kinds of experience along the way. The two components depend on each other and cannot be considered separately. A satisfactory reading of Hegel's thought at any point resembles in structure the listening demanded by the Beethoven sonata, where the part, the note or the phrase must be apprehended both in itself and in its position with respect to the whole, as variation, modulation, reprise, and so forth. It is therefore impossible to select individual insights from the system, to separate valid from the no longer relevant. The terminology and the intellectual equipment of the various chapters presuppose a generalizing attitude towards experience, one which demands expansion if it is to be understood at all. The key ideas of self-consciousness and recognition, of the general and the concrete, of the concept and the notion cannot be analyzed by themselves, for they all depend on and are part of the larger ideal of absolute spirit, of a consciousness for which the supreme value is a development of its own powers by the assimilation of the world outside at length, until at length it reaches the point where it recognizes in itself seeds of everything in the objective universe, where it is able somehow to recognize the latter as being of the same substance with itself. Yet the overall organization is no longer comprehensible for us. The organizational framework, the notion of an absolute spirit, the possibility for the isolated subjectivity to achieve an entire self-contained world, and equivalence within the real world itself, has become inadmissible and even unthinkable in modern society, where the highly restricted worth of the individual subjectivity is only too clear, where people are at once irrevocably interrelated to each other and condemned to view the whole through the distorting windows of their own positions in it. Thus, even though one can reread Hegel, we are never able to reach the vantage point of that last chapter, which would finally permit us to catch a glimpse of the work as a whole. The synthesis remains imperfect, a mere imperative to unity, a dead letter. And this imperfect focus holds true even down to the reading and rendering of the individual sentences. The very indifference to publication, the unrevised and approximate versions in which the system has come down to us, and which offers the paradox of, quote, a thought of such boundless assertions renouncing the attempt to perpetuate itself in definitive and determinate form, end quote, suggests Hegel's own awareness of this dilemma. In the sense in which we nowadays speak of antimatter, Adorno says, the Hegelian texts are antitexts. Such a structure accounts for the unique difficulty presented by a philosopher who can only be read in fragments and only understood in the light of the whole. What happened was that the transitional indeterminacy of the period in which Hegel lived granted him a fortunate mirage, the optical illusion of absolute spirit. And this idealistic, abstract, and indeed imaginary concept was able to serve as the organizational framework for a profoundly realistic set of analyses of the world itself. For the work done depends not so much on the cast of mind of the philosopher as on the possibilities for development inherent in the organizational principle available to him. When Marx, for example, sets back on its feet this, quote, dialectic standing on its head, as he calls the idealism of Hegel, a reversal takes place in which his own material is at once more humanistic and less humane, in which he finds himself limited to the highly technical subject matter of economics. He grounds Hegel in reality, but at the same time engages himself in a specialization from which it is difficult to re-emerge into the wider possibilities opened up by his predecessor. That system into which Hegel organized his thoughts and which he thought to be a property of things themselves was therefore latent in them only, and had not yet been realized in the actual historical world. A completely embodied philosophical system, a concrete intellectual reconciliation between the I and the not I, the subject and the world, would be possible only in a society in which the individual was already reconciled, in fact, with the organization of things and people around him. The concrete reconciliation would have had to precede the abstract formulation of it. So it is no wonder Hegel's system fails, just as it is no wonder that the vast artistic syntheses, which are its equivalent in the 20th century, all crack under the strain of their elaborate universalizing pretense. But they already take place at a lower level of language, no longer on the level of understanding, but rather on that of more elemental and immediate physical and emotional perceptions. And the real wonder is not so much that the Hegelian system fails, as that it could be conceived and executed even to that degree of concreteness which it still possesses. Okay, that is the end of this system. And I don't want to say too much about this system. This section, because I think we already have the terminology. I think we already have the terminology here to reckon with what Jameson is saying in this section, with a couple of exceptions. So the first new important term that we haven't yet introduced, or at least we haven't yet gone over in too much detail, is an idea of totality. So here on page 41, Jameson is talking about this synthesis of subject and object, this temporary synthesis of subject and object, which exists as a short-lived possibility in which the mind is momentarily able to glimpse a concrete totality, completely present at every instant of its unfolding. So this word totality is often misunderstood in Hegel and Marx in particular, because it doesn't mean a system that is totalizing in the sense of we can't get out of it, right? Some have critiqued Marx's system of capital as a totality, and they say the problem with Marx calling capital a totality is that if it is a totality, there is nothing outside of it. And so we are doomed to always exist within capital if we understand totality in this way. Totality for both Marx and Hegel is not that kind of totalizing system, or rather it is, but in a different way. Because to say that a system is totalizing is to already have imagined a possibility beyond it, right? If I say everything in this space is, I'm totally absorbed by everything in this space, or I'm totally subject to the determinations of things in this space. Even though as I say that and as I recognize that in language, the language actually posits something beyond that totality, which is the viewpoint through which I was able to see that I was in a totality in the first place. So in the positing of totality for both Hegel and Marx, there is actually not a foreclosure of the future in the way that some critics have talked about. There is a foreclosure of the future, but it is not a total foreclosure of the future. It is a foreclosure of the future that needs to be worked against, but the totality itself is not actually a distinctly bad thing. To say that there is a totality or that we see a totality is not a distinctly bad thing. Totality is rather a kind of name for the glimpse of a synthesis between subject and object that we can only see through dialectical method. And this is particularly true for Hegel's totality and the notion that is thematized here of absolute spirit in Hegel's philosophical system. So some have critiqued this idea of absolute spirit, and some still critique this idea of absolute spirit as being something equivalent to what we were talking about with the subjective position over here, that it is not materialistic enough, it doesn't consider the world at all, it's fully sort of absorbed in its own thoughts, it's just this guy who is sitting on his armchair philosophizing about the world, thinking that he can understand the whole world through purely his thoughts. And that is not wholly what is going on in Hegel's positing of absolute spirit and totality. What is important to recover from the idea of totality, Jameson is saying, is that it is actually a more concrete way of working through the world, because it doesn't allow slippage into either a fully objective interpretation of the world or a fully subjective interpretation of the world. It holds the dialectic perspective on reality, or the dialectical structure of reality, as possible in temporary glimpses. So this is the first. Here's a nice framing of it in Jameson's text, that what dialectical analysis, the very principle at work in dialectical analysis is is the adequation of subject and object, the possibility of reconciliation of the I, the subject, the capital I, the subject, and the not I, the social, the world out there, the object, right? Of spirit and matter, of self and the world. This is the premise of Hegel's system, and it is virtually Hegel's intellectual invention to posit this dialectical method. Here on the next page, we get Jameson saying the dialectical method is precisely this preference for the concrete totality over the separate abstract parts. So one of the other implications of totality is that we can't parcel off parts of it and analyze them in isolation from their dialectical opposites, from their dialectical dyads. We can't look at the object without considering the subject, right? To return to those motivating terms, we can't think of the concrete without having a notion also of the abstract in our minds or in the back of our minds. We can't think of appearance without essence. We can't think of object without subject. We can't think of content without form. And we can't think of totality without, as I was saying before, positing the possibility of something beyond it. There is this incompleteness to totality, which is the holdout for a future or the possibility of a future in the dialectical method. The dialectical method is not to reduce ourselves, the possibility of our future, to be fully determined by the past. The dialectical method is to hold the possibility of the future of history, as Jameson put it. Down here on the same page, I just wanted to reiterate this point. Jameson says dialectical thought is therefore profoundly comparative. It is not about hierarchicalizing thought in relation to matter, but it is about working through these comparative structures. And one such comparative structure is the idea of analogy and the heroic simile, or the analogy between music and literature that Jameson has been making. So just to reiterate, this is a clear part of the dialectical method for Jameson. This comparativity is so important because there is no unity of a point of view. The dialectical method is not the scientific method that Jameson is comparing it with here, where in trying to understand the entire world, we create this dense system of symbols, this map in the Borges sense of this full map of the world, this map that describes everything in the world, which is therefore the hierarchical entry point through which we see the whole world, right? This is not a philosophy that is a bird's eye vision of the entire world. It is profoundly empirical in a kind of counterintuitive way, and profoundly concrete. This is why this word concrete comes up so much, because it is way on the ground of thinking about the world. Even though it is so abstract and complex, as Jameson marked at the beginning of this section, which is the reason that if we recall, one of the reasons that in this triangle of the English, the German, and the French, the German and French philosophical traditions have failed to make their way into the Anglo-American tradition, which is the exact tendency that Jameson is trying to work against, is because they have this resolute abstractness. They refuse to look at the world through ready-made ideas, right? They insist on the dialectic. They insist on all of these dynamics that we've talked about. They insist on analogy as a way of getting to concretion. Okay, as I said, I don't want to go more into the detail here, because I think we have the language and the thinking to grasp what is being said here. Instead, I want to go on into section 4. Perhaps the only way to keep faith with the Hegelian spirit of systematization in a fragmented universe is to be resolutely unsystematic. In this sense, Adorno's thought is profoundly Hegelian, thinking its motifs through in a genuinely Hegelian spirit, facing thereby its principal formal problem: how to write chapters of a phenomenology when there is no longer any possibility of a whole, how to analyze the part as a part when the whole is not only no longer visible, but even inconceivable, how to continue to use the terms subject and object as opposites, which presuppose, in order to be meaningful, some possible synthesis, when there is no synthesis even imaginable, let alone present anywhere in concrete experience. What language to use to describe an alienated language? To what systems of reference to appeal when all systems of reference have been assimilated into the dominant system itself? How to see phenomena in the light of history when the very movement and direction that gave history its meaning seemed to have been swallowed up in sand? Adorno himself, now in the guise of a theoretician of the essay as a form, has attributed its lack of development in Germany to the reluctance of German writers to surrender themselves to the almost frivolous and inconsequential freedom it presupposes, to make the painful apprenticeship of an intellectual life amidst the fragmentary and the ephemeral, to resist the ontological consolations of the Hauptwerk and the monumental, and to stand in the very river of history itself, suffering their provisory constructions to undergo those ceaseless metamorphoses which make up the life of an idea in time. For the fundamental formal problem of the dialectical writer is precisely that of continuity. He who has so intense a feeling for the massive continuity of history itself is somehow paralyzed by that very awareness, as in some overloading of perception too physical to be any longer commensurable with language. Where all the dimensions of history cohere in synchronic fashion, the simple linear stories of earlier historians are no longer possible. Now it is diachrony and continuity which become problematical, mere working hypotheses. Adorno's larger form will therefore be a construct rather than a narrative. In the work on Schoenberg, of which we have given a brief account above, the formal continuity is not that of Schoenberg's chronological development, although a loose feeling of chronology is maintained, but rather that of a series of abstract moments, of the internal generation out of each other of the fundamental elements or parts of Schoenberg's work seen as a total system. The individual work of art is therefore understood as a balance between inner organs, as an intersection of what we will in a later chapter call determinate categories of a stylistic nature, separate yet profoundly interdependent on each other, such that a modification of one, such as the intensity of instrumental coloration, immediately involves a shift in the proportions of the other, temporal dimensions of the work, contrapuntal development, and so forth. Change takes place in an artist's development as a result of such a modification and the relationships that obtain between the fundamental categories of the work itself. The dialectical critic, however, will plot this change on his graph as a series of moments which generate each other out of their own internal contradictions. Down to footnote 13 here. We will return to this problem, which involves the relative validity of Hegelian and Marxist dialectics, in our concluding chapter. When we turn now to the shorter pieces, and particularly to that series of notes on literature, which is perhaps Adorno's masterpiece, we find that as mental operations, they consist precisely in the perceptual registering and isolation, indeed, in a virtual invention and naming, for the first time, of those categories or component parts of which the larger dialectical form had been an interlocking construction. Let the subjects of some of them, the relations of titles to works, sensitivity to punctuation, the uses of interlarded foreign words and phrases, the physical impression books make, illustrate the working method itself. They imply dialectical self-consciousness, a sudden distancing which permits the most familiar elements of the reading experience to be seen again strangely, as though for the first time, making visible the unexpected articulation of the work into determinate categories or parts. The premise remains that of the most thoroughgoing network of internal relationships, so that it is precisely the apprehension of the apparently discrete and external, the predilection in a novelist, for instance, for epigraphs to his chapters, which as a heuristic principle leads to those deeper formal categories against which the surface is organized. These essays are therefore the concrete working out of that formal category of Adorno's own production, which we have described earlier under the sign of the footnote, an observation which may itself be thought of as a tribute to his method, insofar as it amounts to a pastiche of it. Such essays are thus the fragments of or footnotes to a totality, which never comes into being, and what unites them, I intended to say, is less their thematic content than it is on the one hand their style, as a perceptual present in the time of the process of dialectical thinking itself, and on the other, their basic intellectual coordinates. For what as fragments they share in spite of the dispersal of their raw material is the common historical situation itself, that moment of history which marks and deforms in one way or another all the cultural phenomena which it produces and includes, which serves as the framework within which we understand them. To this concrete situation itself, the language makes fateful and monitory allusion. The administered world, the institutionalized society, the culture industry, the damaged subject. An image of our historical present, which is Adorno's principal sociological contribution, and which yet, as we have pointed out above, is never expressed directly in the form of a thesis. Rather, it intervenes as a series of references to a state of things with which our familiarity is already presupposed, a reality with which we are presumed to be only too well acquainted. The mode is that characteristic German sarcasm, which may be said to have been Nietzsche's contribution to the language, and in which a constant play of cynical colloquial expressions holds the disgraced real world at arm's length, while abstractions and buried conceptual rhymes compare it with the impossible ideal. At the same time, there seems to me to be a profoundly stylistic motivation behind such indirection. We have said that for Adorno, as indeed for Hegel, as for all dialectical thinkers to the degree that they are genuinely dialectical, thinking dialectically means nothing more or less than the writing of dialectical sentences. It is a kind of stylistic obedience analogous to that which governs the work of art itself, where it is the shape of the sentences themselves, above and beyond all conscious reflection, that determines the choice of the raw material. So here also the quality of the idea is judged by the type of the sentence through which it comes to expression. Let me read that sentence again. So here also the quality of the idea is judged by the type of sentence through which it comes to expression. For insofar as dialectical thinking is thought about thought, thought to the second power, concrete thought about an object, which at the same time remains aware of its own intellectual operations in the very act of thinking, such self-consciousness must be inscribed in the very sentence itself. And insofar as dialectical thinking characteristically involves a conjunction of opposites, or at least conceptually disparate phenomena, it may truly be said of the dialectical sentence what the surrealists said about the image, namely that its strength increases proportionately as the realities linked are distant and distinct from each other. Thus, if the work of Adorno nowhere yields that bald statement about the administered world, which would seem to be its presupposition, if he nowhere takes the trouble to express, in outright sociological terms, that theory of the structure of the institutionalized society, which serves as a hidden explanation and essential cross-reference for all the phenomena under analysis, this is to be explained not only by the fact that such material belongs to a study of the infrastructure rather than of ideological materials, and that it is already implicit in classical Marxist economics, but above all by the feeling that such outright statements, such outright presentations of sheer content, are stylistically wrong, the stylistic failure being itself a mark and a reflection of some essential failure in the thought process itself. For in a purely sociological presentation, the thinking subject eclipses himself and seems to let the social phenomenon come into view objectively, as a fact, as a thing in itself. Yet for all that the observer does not cease to have a position with respect to the thing observed, and his thoughts do not cease to be conscious operations, even when he ceases to be aware of them as such. Thus, the overt presentation of content in its own right, whether in sociological or in philosophical writing, stands condemned as a fallback into that positivistic and empirical illusion which dialectical thinking was designed to overcome. Yet if what Sartre would have called the untotalizable totality of Adorno's system, its absent center, cannot be conceptually described as a positivistic theory of society in its own terms, if the placelessness of so-called objective thought is ruled out by the very commitment of the system to self-consciousness, there is nonetheless another way in which such an absent totality may be evoked. It is to this ultimate squaring of the circle that Adorno came in his two last and most systematic, most technically philosophical works, Negative Dialectics and Aesthetic Theory. Indeed, as the title of the former suggests, these works are designed to offer a theory of the untheorizable, to show why dialectical thinking is at one and the same time both indispensable and impossible, to keep the idea of the system itself alive while intransigently dispelling the pretensions of any of the contingent and already realized systems to validity and even to existence. The essential argument of Negative Dialektik and Adorno's ultimate philosophical position seems to me to be an articulation on the theoretical level of that methodology which we have seen at work in a concrete, practical way in the earlier aesthetic essays and critical writings. For there we found that in the long run, the content of a work of art stands judged by its form, and that it is the realized form of the work which offers the surest key to the vital possibilities of that determinate social moment from which it springs. Now, the same methodological discovery proves valid in the realm of philosophical thought itself, and the practice of negative dialectics involves a constant movement away from the official content of an idea, as for example, the real nature of freedom or of society as things in themselves, and toward the various determinate and contradictory forms which such ideas have taken, whose conceptual limits and inadequacies stand as immediate figures or symptoms of the limits of the concrete social situation itself. So it is at the very outset with the idea of the dialectic itself, which had in Hegel, quote, as its foundation and its result the primacy of the subject, or in the well-known language of the introductory remarks to the logic, to the identity of identity and non-identity, end quote. But the very mark of the modern experience of the world itself is that precisely such identity is impossible, and that the primacy of the subject is an illusion, that subject and outside world can never find such ultimate identity or atonement under present historical circumstances. Yet if that ultimate synthesis toward which dialectical thought moves turns out to be unattainable, it must not be thought that either of the terms of that synthesis, either of the conceptual opposites which are its subject and object, are any more satisfactory in their own right. The object considered in itself, the world taken as directly accessible content, results in the illusions of simple empirical positivism, or in an academic thinking which mistakes its own conceptual categories for solid parts and pieces of the real world itself. In the same way, the exclusive refuge in the subject results in what is for Adorno the subjective idealism of Heideggerian existentialism, a kind of ahistorical historicity, a mystique of anxiety, death, and individual destiny without any genuine content. Thus, a negative dialectic has no choice but to affirm the notion and value of an ultimate synthesis, while negating its possibility and reality in every concrete case that comes before it. Such thought therefore aims at maintaining contact with the concrete, painfully continuing a process of thinking about the world itself at the same time that it rectifies its own inevitable falsifications at every moment, thus appearing to unravel everything it had been able to achieve. Yet not altogether, for the genuine content acquired remains, albeit in what Hegel would have called a cancelled and transcended fashion, and negative dialectics does not result in an empty formalism, but rather in the thoroughgoing critique of forms, in a painstaking and well-nigh permanent destruction of every possible hypostasis of the various moments of thinking itself. For it is inevitable that every theory about the world, in its very moment of formation, tends to become an object for the mind, and to be in itself invested with all the prestige and permanency of a real thing in its own right, thus effacing the very dialectical process from which it emerged. And it is this optical illusion of the substantiality of thought itself which negative dialectics is designed to dispel. So it is, for instance, that in a classic essay on society, Adorno shows not only how every possible idea we form about society is necessarily partial and imperfect, inadequate and contradictory, but also that those very formal contradictions are themselves the most precious indications as to how we stand with respect to the concrete reality of social life itself at the present moment of time. For society is clearly not some empirical object which we can meet and study directly in our own experience. In this sense, the neo-positivistic criticism, which considers the idea of society an inadmissible abstract construct or a mere methodological hypothesis with no other kind of real existence, is justified. At the same time, society, precisely in the form of such an impossible suprapersonal abstraction, is present in the form of an ultimate constraint upon every moment of our waking lives, absent, invisible, even untenable. It is at the same time the most concrete of all the realities we have to face. And, quote, while the notion of society may not be deduced from any individual facts, nor on the other hand be apprehended as an individual fact itself, there is nonetheless no social fact which is not determined by society as a whole, end quote. Thus the contradictions of pure thought turn out to reflect the contradictions of their object as well, and that in the very moment when those initial conceptual contradictions seem to forbid us any access to the real object to which they were supposed to correspond. Similarly, in the posthumous aesthetische Theorie, the traditional foundations of aesthetic philosophy are at once discredited and given fresh justification by a constant shuttling back and forth between the historical facts of the world of artistic practice and the abstract conceptual categories through which that practice is perceived, at the same time that they reflect it. We may therefore say that the negative dialectic represents an attempt to save philosophy itself, and the very idea of philosophizing from a fetishization in time, from the optical illusion of stasis and permanency. Such anti-systematic systematization, with all the deep inner contradictions that it involves, reminds me of nothing quite so much as those equally contradictory monuments of modern art and literature, which in their attempt to say everything, end up saying only that one thing, which in their convulsive effort to present themselves in almost medieval fashion as the very book of the world itself, end up being but one book among others in a universe so disparate that no single thought can encompass it. Thus Barthes's observation about Proust, quote, whose work constitutes a simultaneous approach to and postponement of literature itself, might also be applied to Adorno's philosophical position. Quote from Adorno, the writer thereby falls again into the power of time, for it is impossible to negate within the temporal continuum without at the same time elaborating a positive art which must be destroyed in its turn. Thus the greatest modern works linger as long as possible, in a kind of miraculous suspension, on the very threshold of literature itself, in that waiting room situation in which the density of life is given and protracted without yet being destroyed by the creation of an order of signs. End quote. It is therefore not to the discredit of negativa dialectique to say that it is in the long run a massive failure, or in different terms, that it stands as a kind of hyperconscious abstraction of that genuine totality of thought which Adorno's works taken as a whole embody. No doubt the emphasis on method and on theory, rather than the practice of negative dialectics, risks giving an exaggerated and distorted importance to the moment of failure, which is present in all modern thinking. And it is this overemphasis, more than anything else, which seems to me to account for that lack of political commitment with which radical students reproached Adorno at the end of his life. Yet his concrete studies remain incomparable models of the dialectical process, essays at once both systematic and occasional, in which pretext and consciousness meet to form the most luminous, if transitory, of figures or tropes of historical intelligibility. Quote, like its object, knowledge remains shackled to the determinate contradiction. End quote. Okay, so we've made it through all of chapter 1, and I'll just say a brief few things about this final section. And one of the reasons I'll be brief is because we will review this final section and the whole of the first chapter in the next session. So I won't overdetermine this analysis too much by going fully into detail. So let's start with the end here, which is the kind of key point of this section, is that dialectical thinking, as we have been mapping it out in all of these terms, as Adorno's work in particular shows, is always a kind of failure. Right? Why is it a failure? It's a failure because it fails to properly theorize the world. It's a constitutive failure of dialectical thinking that it fails to properly theorize the world, because dialectical thinking recognizes thought as something that cannot be taken away from the world, cannot be divorced from the world, and therefore cannot be made into a viewpoint through which the world can be fully understood. Language, as we emphasized at the beginning, is inherently entangled in any understanding of the world, and only those understandings of the world that are self-conscious of the way in which language is entangled in the world can make any genuine attempt at what Jameson here has called genuine thought. To refuse this genuine entanglement of thought with the world, of subject with object, of spirit with matter, would be to fetishize theory in some sort of sense, to think that theory can exist as this concrete and static thing that we can use to understand the world. This is a colloquial understanding of how theory works. And this is the colloquial understanding that Jameson is working against, I would suggest, in this section, reading Adorno and reading Adorno's works, his entire oeuvre of his works, as a failure of the dialectical method. Because if it were a success of the dialectical method, it would not be the dialectical method in the first place. This is one of the implications. This failure of Adorno and of dialectical thinking is what Jameson here at the bottom of this page calls a kind of miraculous suspension that takes place in all of the greatest modern works, right? And this might be a suspension in multiple senses. It might be a suspension in the sense that when we read these great works, the greatest modern works, we, in our thought, are suspended from the world, which perhaps produces that momentary glimpse of a futurity in this past, present, future conundrum that the dialectical method is after. So the suspension of thought from the world might mean that we are no longer fully determined by the past. We can catch the glimpse of a future. The other way in which the suspension might be working is a miraculous suspension in the work's own value over time, right? The great modern works, or the kind of works with capital L literature that Jameson seems to be referring to here, are ones that seem to continue to resonate in our time. And this is a conundrum for the kind of thinking that would see all of the present as determined by the past. And a sort of thinking that emerges out of that I would put on the same side as object and materialism would be something that we could call historicism. Historicism is the idea that in order to understand something, we need to fully contextualize it in its historical context. And Jameson does, we talked before about Jameson wanting to historicize. Jameson is famous for this statement, always historicize. And so historicism, in putting it on one side of the subject-object divide, suggests that it might be a bad thing because it's at one of the poles that we don't want to fall into, and that would be true if we are interpreting this historicism as a sort of crude historicism, right? All of these are you need to prepend all of these characterizations with an idea of crude, taken to its logical limits. Crude materialism, crude historicism, just as crude idealism is this other side of the equation here. If we get rid of the crudeness of the historicism, if we take historicization seriously, but we also take ideality seriously, then we are on our way towards a dialectical method. It is when we fall headfirst into historicism and say there can never be anything that we can understand without its historical context. There can never be anything that signifies and has value beyond its historical context, that we start to get into sticky territory. Because, as I was saying before, with great works of capital L literature, how is it that Virgil's Aeneid still resonates or still has value today? This is a problem for the historicist, because it was written so long ago, it should no longer resonate with people or with individuals. The same could be said for the music that Adorno is analyzing here in terms of this progression over here. Beethoven, Wagner, Schoenberg, and Stravinsky. Why do these still have value today if the structure of subjectivity has changed in the ways in which Jameson had said that it has, and therefore the resonance of these relationships to tonality and atonality have also changed. So why is it that there is still value in these works? This is the flip side of historicization in some sense, where I would interpret Jameson's statement, always historicize, as being directed at the idealists. Because it is always historicize, but it is not only historicize, right? It is not, historicization is the only thing that you need to do. It is always historicize, but one could, by the same token, say always philosophize. Always philosophize, always historicize. So we could interpret this idea of miraculous suspension in this kind of way as well. Adorno's work is a failure because it can only ever, by virtue of it employing or demonstrating the dialectical method, exist as a kind of waiting room situation in which the density of life is given and protracted without yet being destroyed by the creation of an order of signs. So the order of signs, the language, the theory for explaining life doesn't congeal into a thing in itself, but the density of life is kind of given without yet being destroyed by the creation of an order of signs. Language is something that destroys the density of life because, as we were talking about with Borges' map, once you reduce a physical reality to a map of it, there is something that is lost. And so the dialectical method must do map making without doing map making. This is one way of interpreting what Jameson is saying here with describing again the dialectical process. The very dialectical process from which it emerged. Adorno creates an optical illusion of the substantiality of thought. Because this phrasing, the optical illusion of the substantiality of thought, is giving thought a sort of substance, it's giving thought a power in the world, but it is also recognizing that the power that thought has in that world, in the world, is an illusion or is founded on an optical illusion. So in that kind of movement of the sentence, of that sentence there, we have a sort of dialectical method of acknowledging both sides of the subject-object divide without letting go of either one. And this is the attempt, I would suggest, of all of these dialectical sentences that we've been reading in Jameson's own method. Okay, and finally here, just to recapitulate, the suspicion that we had before in our last session about the idea of the footnote and the heroic simile being essential to this dialectical method, and the parenthesization of Jameson's comments about music in relation, about literature, in relation to music as another sort of footnoting that's going on, is, Jameson explicitly acknowledges here, essential to the dialectical method, and he even says the formal category of Adorno's own production, we could mark them under the sign of the footnote. The footnote is a tribute to his method insofar as it amounts to a pastiche of it. Okay. The final open question that I want to put on our board here is this question here of one of the other fundamental formal problems of the dialectical writer that we haven't yet talked about so much in detail, which Jameson says here on page 50, is precisely that of continuity. He who has so intense a feeling for the massive continuity of history itself, is somehow paralyzed by the very awareness, as in some overloading of perception too physical to be any longer commensurable with language. Where all the dimensions of history cohere in synchronic fashion, the simple linear stories of early historians are no longer possible. Now it is diachrony and continuity which become more problematical, mere working hypotheses. So what this suggests is that in the dialectical method, which we are kind of trying to draw up here, there is something fundamental about temporality, time, and continuity. And this we already suggested in our detailing of the past, present, and the future here, right? That a non-dialectical method results in a deletion of either the future or the past, or maybe even the present. A dialectical method holds open the possibility of the future of history, as Jameson's saying, which is to say it holds the past, present, and the future intact as possibilities. So there is something crucial about time and the experience of time that relates to the dialectical method for Jameson. And when I say experience of time here, there seems to be something problematic for Jameson about the experience of linear time, right? Of time as just one thing going to the next. And we'll start on this next time, the relationship of time to dialectical method, because it has something to do with this central issue of cause in the subject-object. So the experience of time relates to how we see one thing as following from the next, right? In a synchronic fashion, synchrony being there being one chart of time, everything happens on that one chart, and therefore there's a linear notion of cause. Diachrony, or a feeling of multiple times, complicates this notion of linear time in some sense, which also in turn complicates the notion of cause, because the timeline is not fixed on which an event happens. There might be other timelines with which it intersects, and the cause for a particular event, such as this one here, might not be singular. There might be an open question of cause. And as I noted, we'll get into the details of this next time, or we'll start with the details of this next time before going to chapter 2. So thanks for those of you who are sticking with it, and see you next time.